Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Drew's awakening and the hospital send a wave of relief through Port Charles. But that fragile sense of hope was quickly shattered by the reminder that the mysteries and turmoil surrounding the shooting were far from over. His survival was not a conclusion, but a beginning of more unanswered questions, more hidden truths that hovered like a storm cloud over the community. While doctors rushed in and family members breathed easier, the whispers in the corridors of the hospital were clear. Drew's return would unravel secrets that many wanted buried. At the same time, beyond the walls of General Hospital, another crisis was unfolding at the 5 Poppies compound, where Jason, Britt, Jocelyn, and Vaughn were teetering between survival and annihilation. Jason, battle-hardened but stretched to the brink, had thrown himself into the fight to free Jocelyn and Vaughn. The chaos of fists, gunfire, and the cold grip of mercenaries culminated in a moment where his own strength gave out. A guard's arm pressed mercilessly around his throat, his vision dimming, the edges of consciousness slipping away. The sound of his heartbeat pounded in his ears until it began to fade, a drumbeat of mortality closing in. Just as his body faltered and death seemed certain, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. A stranger's hand, swift and precise, struck down his attacker with brutal efficiency. Jason collapsed, air rushing back into his lungs like fire, as the known rescuer disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. He had been saved, but by whom, and at what cost? The mystery figure left more questions than answers, and Jason knew in his bones that this intervention was no coincidence. Meanwhile, Britt was fighting her own battle against time. Shackled with a lethal ankle monitor rigged to detonate if she strayed too far, she had been cornered by Pascal's cold indifference as he activated a 1-hour countdown. Every second was a blade hanging above her head, reminding her of the fragility of life. Yet, somehow, through the chaos and perhaps through the same unseen hand that had saved Jason, she managed to escape the confines of the lab. What should have been a moment of pure desperation became instead a revelation. Britt was no longer just a victim tethered to the whims of her captors. She was transformed into a crucial force, channeling her fear into resolve. In her escape, she became an unlikely ally in Jason's mission, proving that even with death shadowing her steps, she could seize control of her fate. With renewed strength, Jason rejoined the battle, his body bruised but his spirit reignited by the brush with death and the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had invested in his survival. He tore through the compound in a storm of grit and determination, carving a path toward Jocelyn and Vaughn. The scene was painted in sweat and blood, the metallic stench of violence clinging to the air as Jason fought with the singular purpose of getting them out alive. For Jocelyn, seeing him appear in that moment was the closest thing to salvation she could imagine. Vaughn too surged with hope, but fate would not grant them all the same escape. As the final push unfolded, Jason grabbed Jocelyn and pulled her toward the exit, but Vaughn's steps faltered. The walls closed in with enemies at every angle, and the decision was forced upon him. He turned back, weapon in hand, forcing himself between the mercenaries and his companions. The choice was immediate and devastating: hold the line so Jason and Jocelyn could break free, or risk all 3 being slaughtered. Vaughn's eyes locked briefly with Jocelyn's, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. And then he was gone, swallowed by the fight, his figure disappearing into the hail of gunfire and shadows. Jason dragged Jocelyn away, the sound of battle echoing behind them like a funeral dirge. The escape came at a heavy price. Jocelyn's body survived, but her soul carried the fracture of witnessing Vaughn's sacrifice. The image of him standing his ground, choosing death so she could live, etched itself into her memory with the permanence of a scar. She could not escape the guilt that gnawed at her, whispering that his blood was the toll for her survival. The safe air of Port Charles would never feel the same again, for every breath reminded her of the one who could no longer take his. For Jason, the victory of saving Jocelyn was hollow, shadowed by the unanswered riddle of the stranger who had saved him, and the weight of leaving Vaughn behind. In the aftermath of the chaos, Jocelyn carried a wound that no medical treatment could heal. Physically she was safe, alive, and back on familiar ground, but emotionally she was fractured in ways that words could barely capture. Vaughn's absence loomed like a shadow at her side, haunting every thought and every breath. She could still see his face in that final moment, the determination in his eyes as he chose to stay behind, the unspoken promise that her survival was worth his sacrifice. It was a memory that played in her mind on an endless loop, A cruel reminder that while she had escaped, it came at the cost of someone who mattered. The guilt pressed into her chest like a weight, and no matter how much Jason or anyone else told her she wasn't to blame, the voice inside her whispered otherwise. She believed that Vaughn had been pulled into this nightmare because of her, that his blood was a debt she now carried. That kind of guilt was corrosive, capable of reshaping her future decisions, her relationships, and her ability to trust herself. Jason, hardened by years of loss and betrayal, recognized the look in Jocelyn's eyes because he had worn it himself countless times. He had dragged her from the fire, secured her freedom, but he could not save her from the torment gnawing at her soul. He could see it in the way her gaze lingered on empty spaces, as though expecting Vaughn to step out from the shadows, and in the silence that followed when she struggled to find her voice. Jason understood that no rescue could erase what she had witnessed. Vaughn's sacrifice had etched itself into her identity, and Jason knew the scars would follow her into every choice she made moving forward. He vowed silently to protect her, to carry part of that burden if he could, but he also knew that this was a battle Jocelyn would have to fight within herself. Beyond their personal grief, Port Charles itself was simmering with tension. Secrets twisted through every corner of the city. Alexis wrestled with the dangerous reality of Rick being hidden away, a truth that, if revealed, could shatter her fragile stability and put her entire family in jeopardy. Willow, struggling to hold her world together, faced difficult questions from scout questions to painful to answer directly, forcing her into explanations that masked deeper truths. And Anna, relentless in her pursuit of justice, continued to unravel the tangled web surrounding the shooting. Each thread she pulled exposed another knot, another hidden player in a game far larger than the city realized. And yet, the most pressing mystery hung in there like an unspoken threat, the identity of the figure who had saved Jason in his darkest hour. The unknown presence was a specter hovering over their lives, its intentions impossible to read. Was this a silent ally within the WSB, someone embedded in the shadows to ensure Jason's survival? Was it a familiar face returned from the past, someone Jason once trusted or once fought? Or was it something darker, a manipulator playing a long game, using Jason as nothing more than a pawn in a broader conspiracy? The uncertainty left Jason restless, unable to dismiss the thought that his life had been spared not out of mercy but for reasons he had yet to uncover. The explosion in Croatia only deepened the unease, its shockwaves reaching Port Charles with brutal force. Whispers about the remnants of Faison's organization grew louder, and Valentin's increasingly tangled role began to surface in alarming ways. The sense of control that many clung to was slipping, replaced by a growing awareness that a larger war was unfolding, going that stretched beyond borders, beyond reason, and into the heart of everything they thought they understood. For Jason, the weight of it all was compounded by the unpayable debt of Vaughn's death. It was a shadow that clung to him, a responsibility he could never return. Port Charles was no longer the same city it had been before 5 Poppies. Jocelyn's grief became a quiet storm, shaping her into someone harder, more cautious, yet deeply vulnerable. Britt, carrying her own battle with mortality, found herself tethered to Jason's path, both of them marked by the violence they survived. And Jason, forever the soldier, now walked a road defined by unanswered questions and unseen enemies, haunted by the face of a man who had fallen so that others could live. The city would endure, as it always had, but beneath the surface, nothing would ever be the same again. Jason, Britt, and Jocelyn returned to Port Charles with their bodies intact but their minds scarred in ways that no one else could see. The escape from 5 Poppies had not been a victory so much as a sentencione written in blood, guilt, and lingering shadows that would follow them into every corner of their lives. For Jason, who had spent decades staring death in the face, this mission had been different. He had fought through countless enemies, survived gunfire, explosions, and betrayals, but this time his survival had been stolen back from the brink by someone he couldn't name. The memory of the mercenary's arm crushing his throat, of air refusing to come and his body beginning to fail, was etched so sharply into him that even in the safety of Port Charles he woke drenched in sweat. He could still feel the sudden release, the mysterious hand tearing him free, and he could still see the outline of a stranger fading into the shadows. Gratitude burned through him, but so did suspicion. Jason had built his entire life on instinct and trust in his own strength. To be spared at the last moment by an unknown force unsettled him. He could not dismiss the possibility that his savior was no ally but someone with darker intentions. Someone who wanted him alive not out of mercy but because his life still served a purpose in a game he didn't yet understand. The silence of Port Charles did little to quiet the storm inside him. Every step on the pier, every glance in the crowd, carried the weight of paranoia. Was he being watched? Was the mysterious figure still near, pulling strings he could not see? Jason carried those questions like a second heartbeat, loud and unrelenting, knowing full well that in his world, survival was rarely a gift freely given. It was a loan, and one day, the debt would come due. For Britt, survival carried its own kind of torment. She had lived through the terror of wearing an explosive device strapped to her ankle, the ticking clock of mortality counting down each second of her existence. Though she had escaped, the memory lingered with venomous clarity. At night she would awaken with phantom sensations, certain she could still feel the cold metal against her skin, still hear the soft mechanical hum of the timer inching toward destruction. Each nightmare blurred the line between the past and the present until she was left trembling, unable to separate safety from danger. Yet through the horror, something inside her shifted. She knew she was living on borrowed time. The shadow of her illness already marked her days, but the ordeal at 5 Poppies ignited a determination she had long buried. She was no longer content to drift through her final chapter as a victim of circumstance. Instead, she sought to take control, to define her life by what she chose to do with the time left. Helping Jason and Jocelyn escape had felt like more than a desperate act of survival. It had felt like redemption. For once, she had proven to herself that she could be more than selfish instincts, that she could save instead of destroy. That realization gave her strength, but also drew her deeper into danger. Britt understood that every decision she made now carried greater consequences, not just for herself but for the people around her. Port Charles had never been a forgiving place, and her renewed sense of purpose would inevitably push her into conflicts that tested the limits of her resilience. She wanted to be a force of good, but good and survival did not always walk the same path. And in her quest to prove her worth, Britt risked sacrificing the very fragile piece she had clawed back from the jaws of death. Jocelyn, caught between them, bore the heaviest emotional scars of all. Vaughn's absence was a constant ache in her chest, a wound that bled invisibly each time she thought of his final stand. She replayed the moment endlessly, wondering if she could have screamed louder, moved faster, done anything to keep him from being left behind. Jason had pulled her to safety, but safety felt like a prison when her freedom had been bought with someone else's life. She tried to mask her grief, tried to focus on the fact that she was alive, but the guilt gnawed at her with merciless persistence. In her mind, she had been the reason Vaughn was trapped in the first place, the reason he had been forced to choose between his life and hers. That guilt threatened to hollow her out, to strip away the confidence and strength she had fought so hard to build. The three of them walked back into Port Charles as survivors, but each carried a different burden. Jason with his questions, Britt with her fragile redemption, and Jocelyn with her grief. Together they formed a fragile unit, bound by trauma but fractured by the secrets they refused to speak aloud. They knew that 5 Poppies was not the end of the story. The shadows still lingered, and an unseen hand that had spared Jason was proof enough that the war was far from over. Jocelyn carried the heaviest wound of all, and it was one that could not be seen. Vaughn's sacrifice did not register to her as a noble act of valor but as a direct fracture in her heart, an unrelenting reminder that her survival had come at the cost of his life. In the moment Jason pulled her from the carnage, her body moved instinctively toward freedom, but her eyes betrayed her solely clung to Vaughn, watching him turn back into the chaos, standing his ground so she could escape. That final image became burned into her memory, the shape of his figure framed in fire and shadows, the sound of his breath echoing in her ears, and the unshakable truth that he was fighting not for himself but for her. Returning to Port Charles did nothing to soothe that pain. The streets felt the same, her mother's voice was the same, the skyline of the harbor unchanged, but Jocelyn was not the same. She felt hollowed out, carrying with her the unbearable sense that her very existence had been the reason Vaughn was gone. His sacrifice was not something she could compartmentalize. It seeped into every corner of her being, turning joy into guilt and comfort into silence. Where once she had been a girl burning with ambition, defiant and eager to test her strength against the world, she now carried herself like someone aged decades by grief. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, the energy in her laugh vanished, and the restless independence that had once defined her was replaced by a quiet, haunted restraint. At gatherings, when Carly tried to reach for her, when friends encouraged her to open up, Jocelyn retreated further inward. Each word of comfort felt like a reminder of Vaughn's absence. Each gesture of kindness only emphasized the void he had left behind. She could not explain it, nor could she release it. Instead, she let it harden inside her, an invisible scar that grew deeper with every passing day. At the docks, she would often find herself staring into the water, as if waiting for his reflection to appear, as if believing for a moment that he might return. And in her dreams, Vaughn was always there, not as a memory of the man he was but as a presence both protective and accusing, standing at the threshold between life and death, asking her silently why she had lived when he had not. Jason understood this torment in ways others could not. He had walked the battlefield of loss countless times, seen allies and brothers fall in his place, felt the weight of survival pressing down like a curse rather than a gift. Looking at Jocelyn, he saw a younger version of himself, Samine, trying to make sense of carrying on when another had taken the fatal blow. He wanted to reach her, to tell her that she was not responsible, that Vaughn's decision had been his own, but Jason himself was torn by a truth he could not shake. Vaughn had not just stayed behind for Jocelyn, had stayed behind for Jason as well. Jason knew it in the marrow of his bones. Vaughn had created the opening, had given them the chance to survive. And if Jason had been just one step slower, one move less precise, it could have been him instead. For a man who had built his life on protecting others, this truth was unbearable. He had always accepted blood on his hands, but this time the loss felt sharper, because it was tied to Jocelyn, to Carly's daughter, to someone who represented not just a mission but family. That connection made his burden heavier than ever before. Protecting Jocelyn was no longer a task given to him by circumstance, it was a vow forged in Vaughn's death. Jason knew he owed it to Vaughn, owed it to Carly, owed it to himself to keep her safe. He carried the weight of that promise silently, but it fueled every choice he made. Whether it meant stepping into gunfire, walking into traps, or putting his own body on the line, Jason accepted that his role now was not just as her savior in the moment but as her shield moving forward. Vaughn's absence became a debt Jason would never be able to repay fully, but in his mind, the only way to honor it was to ensure Jocelyn lived, even if it cost him everything. And so, while Jocelyn slipped deeper into silence, drowning in the echoes of guilt, Jason grew more watchful, more determined. His instincts sharpened not by the thrill of survival but by the unshakable fear of losing her. He could not change what had already happened, could not bring Vaughn back, but he could carry the burden that Jocelyn could not bear alone. For Jason, Vaughn's death was a scar carved onto his conscience. For Jocelyn, it was the ghost of a man she could never stop loving and never stop mourning. Together, their grief intertwined, binding them to the same vow of survival but for very different reasons, and with very different costs. News of the explosion in Croatia rippled through Port Charles like a shockwave, and settling even those who had grown accustomed to living in the shadow of danger. What had once seemed like an isolated crisis at the Poppies compound now revealed itself as a symptom of something larger, darker, and far more entrenched. The names whispered in hushed tones, Faison, Sidwell, Pascal, Colette, were not merely remnants of past battles but active pieces of a board still in motion. Each was a ghost that refused to be buried, a reminder that the world Jason and his allies had fought so hard to keep at bay was very much alive. And then there was the most unsettling detail of all, Jason's survival, preserved not by his own hand but by the mysterious intervention of a stranger. That singular act raised questions that cut deeper than the explosion itself, because in Port Charles, coincidences rarely existed. Anna, ever the sharp observer, felt the tremor beneath the surface immediately. Her instincts told her that Jason's near-death experience was no random twist of fate, and she could not dismiss the possibility that the figure who saved him was more than a faceless ally. Was it a rogue WSB agent working off the grid, someone tasked with ensuring Jason's survival for reasons yet undisclosed? Or was it something far more sinister, a resurrected enemy, perhaps tied to the Cassadinis, the remnants of Faison's empire, or an unseen network of power players who thrived on manipulation? Her questions became sharper each day, and though she kept her theories close, Her eyes lingered on Jason with the intensity of someone who feared the answer might unravel the fragile stability of everything she had worked to protect. Valentin's reaction only deepened in ease. When word reached him that Jason had escaped death, his composure faltered ever so slightly. The flicker across his face was brief, but it spoke volumes. He knew something no one else did. To those who observed him, Valentin appeared to carry knowledge that made Jason's survival less a miracle and more an inevitability, orchestrated long before the events at Five Poppies. Whether his ties were rooted in personal dealings, hidden loyalties, or unfinished business connected to Faison's legacy, Valentin's silence suggested complicity. His refusal to clarify, to deny, or to explain only fueled suspicion, painting him as a man too comfortable with shadows, too familiar with secrets that could burn the city to ash if revealed. For Britt, the nightmare did not end with her escape. Even within the borders of Port Charles, where she should have found reprieve, a chill followed her. She felt eyes on her, the kind of persistent observation that seeped into her skin and rattled her nerves. Someone was watching, not to protect her, but to tether her to the very crisis she longed to escape. Each time she walked down the hospital corridors, each moment she stepped into the night air, she felt the weight of surveillance pressing on her shoulders. It was as though invisible hands were ensuring she could not stray too far from Jason or Jocelyn, binding the three of them together as unwilling pieces of a puzzle that someone else was assembling. This feeling of being cornered did more than unnerve her. It awakened the part of her that understood how fragile life truly was. Britt, living with the constant specter of her own illness, now had to contend with the reality that her every move might already be accounted for by forces she couldn't see. Elsewhere, Port Charles continued to spin on the axis of its own secrets. Alexis wrestled with the dangerous truth of Rick, a man hidden away and silenced, his existence itself a ticking bomb. Willow faced the impossible task of protecting Scout from a truth too painful for a child to comprehend, forcing her into careful half-truths that only added to her exhaustion. Ava, calculating and restless, wove her own manipulations into the chaos, convinced she could outplay fate if only she could stay one step ahead. But each of them, whether they knew it or not, was being drawn into the same current. The power behind the explosion in Croatia was not a storm that would dissipate. It was a tide rising higher with every passing day, sweeping up everyone in its reach. And in the center of this storm was Jocelyn. Her grief and guilt left her vulnerable, her heart cracked open and raw, making her both the perfect target and the most unpredictable threat. To those who sought to exploit her, she was an easy mark, a young woman drowning in sorrow, susceptible to whispers that promised to ease her pain. Yet, within that same fragility lay the potential for something more dangerous. If Jocelyn could turn her grief into fire, if she could learn to wield her pain instead of being consumed by it, she could become a force capable of shattering the very people who thought to use her. The question was which path she would take, whether her broken heart would bend her into submission or harden into steel. As the city braced for what lay ahead, one truth became clear. Port Charles was standing at the edge of another war, one that blurred the lines between past and present, ally and enemy, grief and strength. Jason's impayable debt to Vaughn, Britt's fragile transformation, and his relentless pursuit of the truth, Valentin's cryptic silence, and Jocelyn's fractured heart were all pieces of a much larger game. And whoever had reached from the shadows to spare Jason's life was not finished yet. Jason, Britt, and Jocelyn returned to Port Charles as survivors, but that word barely captured the truth of who they were now. Survival was not simply walking away from death, it was carrying with them the weight of unanswered questions, the scars of what had been lost, and the knowledge that nothing in their lives would ever be the same. For Jason, every quiet moment became an interrogation. Who had saved him in that final, breathless instant when his body was giving out and his vision had gone black? He had been ready to meet death, and then suddenly he was ripped back from its grip by a hand he could not see, by a figure who disappeared before he could even breathe out his relief. Was it a guardian, a hidden ally in the shadows, or something more sinister, an old enemy playing a longer, more intricate game? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He was alive, but his survival felt like a debt, and Jason Morgan knew debts always came due. For Britt, the questions took a different shape. She replayed the moment of her escape over and over, wondering if fate had spared her only to bind her more tightly to Jason and Jocelyn. the device strapped to her ankle, the countdown to obliteration, the sensation of time itself pressing down on her chest. All of it haunted her even within the familiar walls of Port Charles. But what kept her awake at night wasn't just the memory of fear. It was the way she had changed because of it. Britt had faced death, and instead of shrinking away, she had stepped into the fire and found herself capable of more than she ever believed. She had helped save Jocelyn, she had stood shoulder to shoulder with Jason, and she had tasted the fragile but undeniable possibility of redemption. Yet the city did not feel safe, not truly. She felt watched, manipulated, and woven into a conspiracy that would not allow her to step away quietly. Her survival, like Jason's, was not clean. It was tangled in threads she did not yet understand. Jocelyn bore the heaviest burden. Vaughn's fate hung over her like a shadow too large to escape. Was he truly dead, consumed in the chaos of their escape, or was he still alive somewhere, suffering in silence, a prisoner of the same forces that had torn them apart? Jason had tried to assure her that Vaughn's sacrifice had meaning, that his choice gave them the chance to live, but Jocelyn could not silence the voice inside her that screamed of guilt. She saw herself as the reason Vaughn had been left behind, the anchor that had dragged him into the storm. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, felt the weight of his absence, and questioned whether she had been worth the price. Yet within that grief, something dangerous was forming, the tension between vulnerability and defiance, between surrender and transformation. Jocelyn was at a crossroads. She could allow her pain to break her, to be molded into a pawn for those who sought to exploit her shattered heart. Or she could wield her loss like a weapon, letting it forge her into something stronger than she had ever imagined. The city around them, too, was shifting. Port Charles had weathered countless tragedies, betrayals, and wars of power, but this time felt different. The whispers of Faison's legacy, the re-emergence of Sidwell, the silence of Valentine, and the uncertainty surrounding Colette painted a picture of a network not destroyed but evolving. The explosion in Croatia was not an end but a signal flare, proof that a larger storm was building. And at the center of it were Jason, Britt, and Jocelyn, three figures tied together by fate, trauma, and a mission they did not fully understand. Jason's survival had not been random, Britt's redemption was not without cost, and Jocelyn's grief was more than personal. It was the lever by which enemies could move mountains. The questions were relentless. Who had pulled Jason back from the brink, and what did they want in return? Was Vaughn's story truly over, or had his absence been staged to serve a greater plan? And how long before Jocelyn's pain became either her greatest strength or the weapon used to destroy her? Port Charles stood on the edge of another reckoning, one that would not merely shake the city but tear into its very core. The storm had already begun to form, and its eye was fixed not on the familiar powers of old, but on the three survivors who had come back from the edge of death, scarred and settled, and destined to face a war far larger than themselves.